The history of the exploration and colonization of the Americas by the kingdoms of Europe in the so-called Age of Discovery is filled with accounts of expeditions venturing into the unknown, often with disastrous consequences. However, in a period riddled with failed voyages, the journey of Pánfilo de Narváez has the rather dubious honour of standing out, both in terms of the geographic length of the journey and the sheer number of men who perished following this Spanish aristocrat into the impenetrable swamps which cluster along the shores of the Gulf of Mexico. In the summer of 1527, Narváez left Spain with 600 men. 10 years and near countless hardships later, just 4 survivors stumbled into Mexico City. Before we go any further, we must set the scene. In the early 1520s, the enormous potential of the Americas had become apparent to the monarchs of Europe as a result of Hernán Cortés's successful overthrow of the Aztec Empire, and of course his discovery of a great deal of gold in the process. Naturally, this success generated a great deal of interest in similar expeditions. Pánfilo de Narváez was well situated to benefit from this increased interest. He was no stranger to the New World, having participated in the Spanish conquests of Jamaica in 1509 and Cuba in 1511. He was related to the Spanish governor of Cuba, Juan Velázquez de Cuellar, and had even led a force of some 1,400 men sent by the governor to force Hernán Cortés to return to Cuba in 1590. Famously, Cortés's decision to ignore the orders of the governor, defeat Narváez's force, and press on with his expedition led to the eventual defeat of the Aztec Empire in 1521. No doubt Narváez, who was actually imprisoned by Cortés for 2 years during this failed expedition, felt he had unfinished business in North America. Having returned to Spain embarrassed, in 1526 Narváez obtained from the Spanish king Charles V the holy grail of exploratory prizes, a license to claim the Gulf Coast of what is now the continental United States, the right to found settlements, and the governorship of this new territory. Charles also appointed an agent to act as second in command, charged with ensuring the interest of the crown, a certain Alvar Nunez Cabeza de Vaca, whose incredibly lucid account of the entire ill-fated expedition is our primary source of the voyage. Indeed, the Relacion y Comentarios, the account and commentaries, offers the earliest known and most exquisitely detailed description of indigenous American peoples and their customs. Funding was apparently not hard to come by once royal assent had been acquired. Narváez readily found investors, buoyed by tales of Cortés's astounding discoveries, who outfitted him with 450 soldiers, 150 sailors, wives and slaves, as well as a whole host of supplies, tools, equipment and weapons. On the 17th of June, 1527, the fleet set out from the port of Sanlúcar de Barrameda to seek their fortune in the Americas. Narváez's expedition got off to a rather inauspicious start. Upon arriving in Hispaniola in August, a whopping 150 men deserted. Whilst desertion was a perennial issue on any kind of military campaign, especially a dangerous venture into the unknown such as this one, the news of the failed expedition of Lucas Vázquez de Ayllón to modern-day South Carolina, in which hundreds had perished, may have had quite a hand in causing the mass flight of Narváez's men. Undeterred, Narváez sailed to Cuba in September, using his contacts on the island to recruit replacements and purchase another boat. When 2 ships sank in a sudden storm, Narváez, displaying a shrewdness that would be sadly lacking later in the campaign, elected to winter in Cuba in order to replace the lost ships and sailors. By the 20th of February 1528, the refitted fleet, consisting of 5 ships, 400 men and 80 horses, was ready to sail. Narváez had also recruited a pilot, the navigator Diego Miruelo, who claimed to have successfully explored Florida's west coast in 1516. Miruelo's credentials are somewhat unknown. It is perhaps telling that the fleet immediately ran aground off the Canarreos shoals off the southern coast of Cuba, further delaying progress by another 2 weeks. In favour of not wasting any more time, Narváez dispensed with a planned stop at Havana and made straight for the Gulf of Mexico. After several weeks of being buffeted by the strong currents of the Gulf Stream, Narváez's men made the coast of Florida, spotting land just north of Tampa Bay, but not before one of the expedition's ships was sunk in high winds. On the 15th of April, 1528, the remaining 4 vessels landed at what is now St. Clement's Point. A cursory exploration of the nearby land revealed a number of empty native houses, with the largest with enough space for some 300 people. Narváez was encouraged. Here was evidence that the region was capable of supporting large populations who might be motivated to part with any precious metals that they might possess. The following day, in a ceremony on the shore, the expedition's royal representatives declared Narváez as governor of La Florida and read the requerimiento, a decree stating that the land belonged to Charles V by order of His Holiness the Pope. The requerimento rather ominously ended with the following, warning what would befall any natives who resisted the authority of the Spanish crown. I certify to you that, with the help of God, we shall powerfully enter into your country, and shall make war against you in all ways and manners that we can, and shall subject you to the yoke and obedience of the Church and of their highnesses. Formalities observed, Narváez struck inland and discovered Old Tampa Bay. The navigator Miruelo had described an enormous harbour which lay to the south, and Narváez now sent him off on one of the ships in search of it, with orders to return to Cuba if unsuccessful. Meanwhile, Narváez pressed onwards, discovering yet another native village, this one inhabited, and containing corn and a small amount of gold, a very promising sign for the conquistadors. Perhaps in an effort to evict the Spaniards, the village's native inhabitants described how the land of the Apalachee, far to the north, contained a great wealth of gold. This had the desired effect, as the tales of the precious metal inflamed the imaginations of Narváez and his officers. He proposed a bold strategy, to split his forces, marching overland with 300 men, while the remaining 100 would sail up the coast in the last 3 ships, in parallel with the land army. De Vaca counselled against the move, citing the lack of an interpreter, the poor condition of the expedition's 40 malnourished horses, the scant provisions, and the totally unknown land in front of them. However, all the talk of gold was apparently enough for Narváez to convince the other officers. De Vaca was outvoted, and the expedition split. On the 1st of May, 1528, the long march through the interior of Florida began. As De Vaca had predicted, hardship descended upon them almost immediately. The country was barren of nourishment. They encountered no natives, and after 2 weeks, the 300 beleaguered men were close to starvation. Happening across a village north of the Withlacoochee River, the Spanish were able to loot some supplies, but unable to find the coast, and with no sign of the main fleet, they had little choice but to press onwards into the unknown. As De Vaca would later discover, the 3 ships, having lost contact with Narváez's column, sailed south to the original landing site. There they reunited with Miruelo, who had sailed to Havana and returned with another supply ship. The combined fleet would proceed to rove the coast for up to a year, searching for Narváez, before finally giving up and sailing to Mexico. Still hopeful of being reunited with the fleet in northern Florida, Narváez pressed on. Some relief from the perennial hunger was found in the territory of the Timucua people of northern Florida, a country filled with large forests and amazingly tall trees, according to De Vaca. Their chief, Dulcenchelin, provided the Spanish with food in the form of corn. Upon crossing the Suwannee River, Narváez could only watch horrified as Officer Juan Velasquez's horse bolted, drowning both horse and rider. His death was the first non-shipwreck casualty of the expedition. Conditions did not improve upon reaching Apalachee territory. The discovery and subsequent capture of a small village of some 40 houses yielded a good deal of corn. However, there was no gold to be found, and before long the expedition was beset by hundreds of Appalachian warriors. Utilizing guerrilla tactics, the Appalachian launched several lightning assaults on the more heavily armoured Spaniards, loosing a hail of arrows before disappearing back into the lakes and swamps which punctuated the landscape. Morale plummeted further when it was discovered from captive Appalachian that the village was in fact the largest in the area, and that the surrounding country was sparsely populated. 3 parties sent out by Narváez apparently confirmed this. In what was perhaps another successful attempt to dislodge the unwelcome visitors, a captured Appalachian chief described the coastal village of a people known as the Arte. His tales of plentiful corn, beans, squash, and fresh fish were enough to convince the famished Spaniards. After 25 fruitless days spent in the Appalachian village, they set out south. The road to the Arte was a nightmarish journey through near impenetrable swampland, harried at every turn by the vengeful Appalachian. Weighed down by armour and weapons, progress was frustratingly slow. Although the expedition's arquebuses and crossbows were powerful weapons, their reload time meant that the Appalachian bowmen could loose 3 or 4 shots in the time it would take the Spanish to fire 1. De Vaca described how they were able to hit a target at 200 paces with ease, often waiting until the soldiers were waist deep in swamp water before launching an assault. Casualties began to mount, with dozens of men killed outright or succumbing to their injuries or disease. Finally reaching the Arte village after a 9-day journey, Narváez and his men were relieved to find the village empty, and a large amount of corn and beans ripe for harvesting. However, despite this brief respite, Narváez's men were in a sorry state. Dozens were wounded or sick, and all were suffering from the effects of starvation and exhaustion. The expedition had thus far failed to find any gold, and had failed even to find lands fit for the foundation of a settlement. Attacked by the people they had intended to subjugate, the Spaniards were desperate. Realizing their salvation lay in finding the sea, Narváez sent de Vaca with 50 men to seek the coast, who were successful in locating oyster beds, a precious source of food and a clear indication that the sea was nearby. Relocating to these oyster beds, a new plan was hatched, born of desperation and a renewed fortitude at the glimmer of hope which had presented itself. Reforge the weapons into tools, construct boats, and sail to Mexico. On the 4th of August, work began. A forge was constructed of logs, fueled by charcoal, and fed by deerskin bellows. Weapons were melted down and recast as saws, hammers, and nails. Pine tree pitch became makeshift cork, and palmetto leaves were used as oakum to waterproof the vessels. Clothing was sewed carefully into sails. The expedition's horses met their fate, their hair used for rope and their skins for water storage. They even lent the bay their name. The Spanish dubbed what is now Appalachian Bay as Bahía de los Caballos, apparently in honour of the animals. On the 20th of September, the gargantuan effort was complete. 5 small boats, each around 32 feet long, along with 242 starving and exhausted survivors, sailed from the bay on the 22nd of September. Navigating the convoluted inlets of Appalachian Bay proved to be difficult, but after 7 days sailing, the fleet reached the Gulf of Mexico itself, before making immediately westwards for 30 days. Continually haunted by the spectre of hunger and thirst, the miserable Spaniards were forced to put ashore at native villages in modern Gulf Breeze and Mobile Bay to obtain supplies, being attacked by unfriendly locals both times. Passing the mouth of a great river, which is thought to have been the Mississippi, they found blessed relief in the form of a small freshwater river and drank their fill. However, this fortune would prove to be the last for the Narváez expedition. 2 days after departing, strong winds and the Gulf current drove the ships out to sea, separating them in the darkness of night. As the sun rose and de Vaca's vessel caught up with Narváez's boat, the expedition leader ordered his men to row to shore. When de Vaca, his ship slowed by an exhausted crew, requested a tow from Narváez, the governor refused. Reportedly, he told de Vaca it was no longer necessary for any of us to give orders, that each of us should do what seemed best to save his life, since that is what he intended to do. With Narváez apparently abandoning his men to their fate, de Vaca did what he could for the beleaguered crew of his vessel. They steered westwards for 4 days before witnessing one of the other boats foundering in a storm which drove de Vaca's ship ashore, where it ran aground on what is now Follett's Island, near Galveston Island, Texas, on the 6th of November. Mercifully, the local inhabitants did not prove to be initially aggressive. In fact, de Vaca described how they sat down in the sand and wept upon witnessing the pitiful sight of the half-dead Spanish sailors attempting to relaunch their boats. Reunited with the crew of one of the other vessels marooned further along the coast, the 80 or so survivors soon shrank to 14 or 15 as starvation and exposure to the elements inevitably took their toll. De Vaca and his fellow unfortunates remained on what he dubbed the Island of Misfortune, surviving in servitude to the indigenous peoples scattered across the island, who demanded they act as healers. Separated from one another, their number dwindled over the 6 years that de Vaca remained there, before the Spaniard was finally able to escape. Making his way to the mainland, he learned of 3 other survivors who had been enslaved by a separate tribe. Locating them, the 4 men were eventually able to escape their bondage together in the September of 1534. De Vaca also learned from his compatriots what had come of Narváez. The governor's ship, which had put ashore in the same storm which wrecked de Vaca's vessel, had been swept out to the ocean with the governor himself aboard, never to be seen again. Rejoicing at their astounding survival, the 4 resolved to travel westwards in search of Christian lands. A whole additional video could be devoted to the onward journey of de Vaca and his companions, Andreas Dorantes de Carranza, Alonso del Castillo, and a Moroccan slave named Estevanico. The 4 men survived by acting as healers and traders, occupations which allowed them safe passage westwards through what is now modern Texas, into the northern Mexican states of Tamaulipas, Nuevo León, Coahuila, and possibly crossing into the US states of New Mexico and Arizona. Traversing the modern Mexican states of Chihuahua and Durango, they turned south along the coast of California into Sinaloa before finally encountering Spaniards at what is now Culiacan in Mexico. It was in 1537 that the 4 men finally limped into Mexico City, from where they sailed to Spain. Narváez's disastrous expedition had claimed a decade of their lives. For Narváez himself and the expedition's hundreds of lost, it had a far higher toll. Upon his return to Spain, de Vaca penned his Relacion y Comentarios, a text describing the entire expedition, including fascinating accounts of the landscape and anthropological notes on the indigenous peoples encountered en route. It forms our primary historical source for the ill-fated Spanish expedition and the main source for the writing of this video. If you're interested in learning more, I'd highly recommend checking it out. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy these videos, you can find additional content on my Patreon. You can also get early access to future videos and access to deleted scenes, in other words, sections that I cut from the main video.